An important way to think about when you look at value chains or look at the supply chains is to think about how do firms decide to make something or buy it. The process of making something implies integration or contractual arrangements. Buying just means we're going to buy it based on price in the market. As we talked about in this course, these chain captains, the redesign of these value chains, more and more firms are looking at making things through integration or contractual arrangements as opposed to the way we used to do things, and certainly just going out and buying a commodity product and converting it into some type of generic food product. So the firm has to decide whether we're going to make something, vertically coordinate something, or buy it in the open market. And the two broad ways of coordination are vertical integration, which implies that a firm builds a plant to control the product, or a contractual arrangement, and typically we think of these as production or marketing type contracts, and we'll talk about these in this module. As we think about this make or buy decision, this diagram from Martinez and Reed at the U.S. Department of Agriculture I think is a useful way of looking at things. This over here is the make decision, and this over here is the buy decision. Historically, much of agriculture was done around buying things. We buy number 2 yellow corn. We buy fluid milk. We buy beef that's on a live weight basis. And then we convert it into some generic product over here. What we're seeing is, as we've redesigned these value chains, we're seeing increasingly more information needed about the commitment and the relationship. And in doing so, it can decrease the impact that an individual producer has. So as we go to more and more of a what I call a make type decision, we use marketing contracts, production contracts, and so forth. These all have implications for how a producer operates their farming operation. In a buy decision, a farmer just sold their corn or livestock or milk at whatever price the market had. As they're making something, now they're looking at different types, so different types of breeds and dairy cows, different types of corn, maybe high lysine corn for feed use, or a starchy corn for use in corn ethanol production. All of these things have implications for how the supply chain is being redesigned. So literally, what is the make or buy decision? I'm not going to go through this. You can pause here if you want and look at this. You've also got the slides for this production. But as we think about how we go through this process, a firm says, look, at this very generic point, if I'm a farmer, can I get volume premiums or volume discounts? So volume matters. At a very basic level, can I get volume premiums or volume discounts? If I can't, can I get a better price by doing a supply agreement with someone? And so there's different ways of thinking about this. If I can get volume premiums and discounts, then I'm going to try to do so as a large farmer. And so this graph I think is very useful for thinking about how a farmer thinks about themselves in the value system or supply chain. So I've used this example throughout the course. Here's a way of thinking about the make or buy decision. What does a firm decide to own or buy? If I'm General Mills and I have a processing plant, do I need to own the trucks or rail cars that ship my product from that plant? Or can I contract that stuff out? Do I need to own or source the products I'm sending into my plant, or can I buy those from somebody else? If I'm a retail grocer as a buyer, do I need to own the trucking firms and wholesale distribution warehouses to get my product onto my shelf? What we're seeing in the case of Walmart and large companies like Costco, they are in fact integrating backwards, and we're seeing firms integrate backwards toward production and agriculture. So in general, we're seeing more and more people integrate backwards this way in our supply system. Going back to our value chain governance slide, again, here's another way of thinking about that. We're moving more and more to the right. Here is the make side. Here is the buy side. We're gradually moving this way in terms of how we look at these arrangements. So as we think about this make or buy decision, what parts of this vertical boundary of the firm The firm, the outside boundary of the firm is where it decides to make inside that boundary. Going outside that boundary, how far do they want to push that boundary? So if I'm a manufacturer, do I want to push my boundary and own trucks or rail cars or barges? If I'm a retail grocer, do I want to expand my boundary by going back into owning wholesale warehouses? So if we think about this, going back to the Adam Smith example of the invisible hand, which was, I think it was a buy decision, or the visible hand of the organization, which is the make decision, a firm has to decide is a particular asset a source of competitive advantage or not. If it's easily available in the marketplace, then maybe I don't need to make it. And so as we think about all this, all these things matter from a firm strategy perspective. And you'll talk more about this if you go take a class like APEC 4821 or take a strategy class over in the Carlson School of Management. We think about input price risk. We talked about this in the terms of the determinants of supply module. We can use forward or futures contracts to hedge input price risk. We could also create some type of self-insurance fund in terms of vertical integration. And so vertical integration could be a risky activity that could add to risk if we don't think about this correctly. So why would a firm choose to just buy something and not make it? So, you may have patents or technology that makes low-cost production possible. You can do this by yourself. People in the marketplace can have economies of scale that you can't get on your own. So typically what you're going to find out is firms like Cargill or ADM or Bunge, those firms have got tremendous economies of scale for supplying things like cocoa or coffee or grain and so forth onto grinders or manufacturers. And those manufacturers, it makes no sense to vertically integrate backwards because those firms have got so much cost efficiencies in their operation. We have something called agency and influence cost. So as long as I'm efficient and innovative, a task can be done in-house. Agency costs are a big, huge problem if I have to develop a cost center to do this. And so it may be more difficult for me to actually make the product if I have an agency problem inside my firm. Larger firms have only got so much capital to allocate for different types of activities. So a firm can't vertically integrate in every single thing. It's impossible because of the capital issues. So what are the influence? Who are the people that will influence whether or not a firm is going to vertically integrate? What's their power base in the organization? And so what are the resources needed to do that? It may make sense to vertically integrate some things and not vertically integrate other things. So if I'm trying to create, for example, an organic label, I need to vertically integrate backwards or coordinate somehow backwards to production to make sure that in fact what I have is organic. I don't want a company testing my products and finding out they're not organic. That somehow the product was not produced in organic matter. So I want to make sure that if I'm going to create that type of label, that in fact I've got that production. Why do firms decide to vertically integrate or coordinate? There might be some cost. I may have partners who don't want to share valuable private information. So if I've got information on technology, those firms may not want to share that with me. And so, but I may want to coordinate myself to get access to that. So think about recipes, for example, of developing different types of milk powder. We've got patents on certain types of milk dairy proteins. And so those proteins, those were developed using lots of capital expenditures by firms. They don't want to just give that patent information away, but they will coordinate the use of those with firms who want to use that. And so there may be ways to go ahead and vertically integrate that. Firms often use contracts because there are certain tasks being performed outside the firm. So think about trucking. I want the trucks typically I want employees in a warehouse to be on hand when a truck comes to unload that product. I don't want the truck coming at 4 in the morning and have to pay overtime to employee to unload that truck. So I want a truck, might have a contract that says the truck will come between certain hours a day, so I know I've got employees scheduled to unload that truck. And these contracts allow us to develop these type of programs. It's pretty difficult to devise what we call a complete contract. And so we've had a number of Nobel Prize winners in economic sciences that have tried to figure out ways to write a complete contract, but it's often difficult to write what we call a complete contract. There's no way to plan for every single contingency in these contracts. We need to have a way within the contracts, have an outside third party like a judge or arbitrator who are able to evaluate or enforce the contract if there's some type of failure. And so in real life, most contracts are incomplete because we can't plan for everything. There is some ambiguity in every one of these contracts. What are a couple reasons why we don't have complete contracting? We have something called bounded rationality. We can't think of all things, right? We've only got certain types of information. Deal with complexity. Several years ago, I was working on a program in Saudi Arabia, teaching an MBA program, and a volcano erupted in Iceland. It sent volcanic ash all across Northern Europe. It shut down plane travel. When I bought my plane ticket, there was no way for me to figure out how would I get on another plane to get back to the United States because I had never thought about the issue of a volcano erupting and causing my travel to be delayed back to the United States. I couldn't even think about that in my mind when I bought that airplane ticket. So it's unfair for me to penalize the airlines for something that I couldn't think about at that particular point in time. Typically, contracts have got things like normal wear and tear. We can't always know what these are. So in agriculture, for example, we've got things that may be related to different types of production. Think about a simple thing like bushels. What is a bushel? We typically say corn has got 56 pounds to a bushel, but it may not be that every corn. We don't take a bushel basket and go out and measure every single corn cob and put it into or ear of corn and put it into a bushel basket. So bushel, even though it's got a very discrete number, 56 pounds of corn to a bushel, may have a different interpretation because we really can't go out and measure all of those when we're aggregating up to corn in terms of ton basis or pound basis. We may not be able to have the same information when we write a contract. So certain things like organic are defined by the U.S. Department of Agriculture or non-GMO. But until recently, for example, if I were to use corn produced with a genetically modified seed and make corn sweetener from that, the DNA strands that I used to determine whether or not it was GMO would disintegrate through the processing into a corn syrup. And so I had RNA strands, but that's not really the same as a DNA strand to call something GMO or non-GMO. And so that was a problem for for people that were taking sugar and processing sugar beets, for example, or sugarcane, or producing corn into corn sweetener. In the case of sugar beets, we had genetically modified sugar beets. In the case of corn, most corn varieties were genetically modified. And so that issue was a big issue in terms of asymmetric information. Contract laws, nobody likes to go to court. Nobody likes to have lawyers on staff because they're expensive. The more litigation weakens a business relationship. So as long as we have good contract law between participants, it's going to make the food system work better. If we don't have good coordination, we're going to have bottlenecks in the food system. So as we move more and more to design attributes, a clean label which says that certain types of ingredients are only the things that will be allowed, certain types of labels, coordination becomes very, very critical when we're trying to design a food value chain or food supply chain because of a chain captain. And so these firms are going to rely more and more on contracts with delivery dates, design tolerances. And so we're going to look more and more about those design attributes in terms of the food system. We don't want certain information to leak out, so we're not going to outsource certain things if we're going to worry about our patents, or we're going to worry about certain things that people can replicate on their own. Transaction costs are really, really important, and they help explain why certain economic activities occur outside the price system. So the more transaction costs we have, the more likely it's going to be that we're going to see firms making stuff inside their firm as opposed to contracting that and buying that outside the system. Relation-specific assets, think about a corn ethanol plant. Corn is needed for the corn ethanol plant. The corn ethanol plant can't use something else. If we want to use grain sorghum, it'd be very difficult to convert. So corn ethanol plant is dependent upon a supply of corn to produce that plant. The same thing is true for a sugar beet factory. The sugar beet factory needs the sugar beets that are produced near the plant. So those plants are relationship-specific assets. So those two parties, the sugar beet farmer and the sugar beet processing plant, the corn farmer and the corn ethanol plant, are pretty much locked into each other in terms of relationship. They need each other to coexist. And we just talked about different types of those in the case of site specificity and physical asset specificity. Another way to think about this are things like grain elevators at the port terminals. So land around ports where we're going to build port terminals to load ocean-going vessels with different types of products, those are pretty site-specific assets. They have no other use except for unloading ocean-going vessels. We just talked a bit about these. Think about can-producing factories, making aluminum cans or steel cans. Oftentimes, we're going to produce those in areas where there's a big demand for can-filling plants. Think about making pasta. Oftentimes, we're going to take durum wheat, which is a big part of the durum production, move that durum wheat from North Dakota to Montana, and we're going to build pasta manufacturing plants outside demand points like Chicago or New York or the southeast part of the United States. Where consumers are going to consume lots of parts of pasta, we'll build pasta plants because it's easier to ship the durum wheat than it is to ship pasta in rail cars or trucking facilities. We've got physical asset specificity. So, for example, in Blair, Nebraska, we have a number of operations that are all designed to use corn to manufacture things. And so that big, huge asset of Blair, Nebraska manufactures all types of products made from corn. And those factories are all located close to each other because Blair, Nebraska is near eastern Nebraska and western Iowa, which is where the price discovery process for corn is typically going to generate when we think about the U.S. corn supply. Dedicated assets, typically these are made to satisfy a single buyer. So think about building, for example, an organic factory for making meat. We're not going to process lots of animals in that factory, but we're also not going to have a lot of people buying the organic products coming from that factory. So we're probably going to have some type of contractual arrangement to build that. Similarly, if I'm going to build a milk processing plant to only use milk from cows that have the A2 protein, which is supposed to not have that lactic acid protein that makes consuming dairy products uncomfortable for some people, I may want to build a processing plant designed to only handle milk around and build a milk supply around those plants that's going to have that A2 protein in it. Sometimes we have human asset specificity. So chefs, for example, certain types of chefs that have know-how to make food products. We've got scientists that are very good at using different types of products to produce things from wheat or fruits and vegetables. They've got a certain skill set that can't be replicated very easily. So a second type of transaction cost problem is what we call the hold-up problem. Investments may have to be made to improve the bargaining positions. So oftentimes a firm is not going to buy all of their products. They're actually going to vertically integrate so you understand the cost of doing something. So Nestle, for example, has got 20 or 24 milk sheds around the world. Those milk sheds supply milk so Nestle can make infant formula and different types of products. But they also make some investments in their own dairy farms. They understand the cost of production in those areas. So they know the problems that a dairy farmer might have and helps them learn about dairy production. They're not going to own 100% of the dairy farms, but they may own 5% of those farms as a way to understand the process of making milk within that type of milk shed. So sometimes when we have a hold-up problem, the investment made in relationships with specific assets may lose their value. So we don't want to have these hold-up products because we may delay investment of building those manufacturing plants or processing plants. So as we think about some of these things and why firms may choose to make something in terms of coordinate or integrate something, it's because these relationships with specific assets support a particular transaction. As these supply chains are being disrupted in the food system, as we're building segregated supply chains, as we're building chain captains who are in charge of those chains, they want relationships with specific assets to support the whole redesign of that food system.